do hope you are doing well. We are here to enjoy some books, since Sans has kindly allowed me to have a break, we'll say. His tab is a little high, although I'm sure we're supposed to have someone else, I believe. I think the little... Oh, hello to everyone. PlushieChild, Johann, Undertale Geek, and Nightshade as well. I believe we're supposed to have one more. Could be wrong though. Pardon 1 second. Not sure when they'll be joining, but they should be joining soonish. Hopefully. Hopefully. But, as of right now, it is us. We have today... Hello everyone. We have today a lovely menu. And shall we get started then? I do hope everyone is doing well. I hope you all have your, I believe humans call it cuddle buddies, I believe. Stuffed animals. Almost comforting, I believe, for a human. Now then, let us begin. The Erl-King by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Who's riding so late where winds blow wild? It is the father grasping his child. He holds the boy embraced in his arm. He clasps him snugly. He keeps him warm. My son, why cover your face in such fear? You see the Erl-King, father? He's near, the king of the elves, with crown and train. My son, the mist is on the plain. Sweet lad, oh come and join me do. Such pretty games I will play with you. On the shore grey flowers the colour unfold. My mother has many garments of gold. My father, and can you not hear the promise the Erl-King breathes in my ear? Be calm, stay calm, my child, lie low. In withered leaves the night wind blows. Will you, sweet lad, come along with me? My daughters shall care for you tenderly. In the night my daughters the reveille keep. They'll rock you and dance you and sing you to sleep. My father, oh can you not trace the Elf-King's daughters in that gloomy place? My son, I see it clear, how grey the ancient willows appear. I love you, your comeliness charms me, my boy, and if you're not willing, my force I'll employ. Now father, he's seizing my arm, Elf-King has done me a cruel harm. The father shudders, his ride is wild, in his arms he's holding the groaning child, reaches the court with toil and dread. The child in his arms was dead. And thus the end of the story it is. Such a sad thing. It's never a happy day. Never, when a child dies. The next is How He Left the Hotel by Louisa Baldwin. This one is one of my favourites actually. It's a little dark. Okay, it's quite a bit dark, but it's not that dark. At least, I don't think it is. Pardon as I have misplaced my bookmark. How He Left the Hotel, again, by Louisa Baldwin. I used to work the passenger left in the Empire Hotel, the big block of buildings in lines of red and white brick, like streaky bacon, that stands on the corner of Elm Street. I'd served my time in the army and got discharged with good conduct stripes. And how I got the job was in this way. The hotel was a big company affair, with a managing committee of retired officers and such like, gentlemen with a bit of money in the concern and nothing to do but fidget about it, and my late colonel was one of them. He was a good-tempered man. He was as good a tempered as a man who ever stepped when his will wasn't crossed. And when I asked him for a job, "Mole," he says, "you're the very man to work the lift at our big hotel. Soldiers are civil and businesslike, and the public like 'em, only second best to sailors. We had to give our last man the sack, and you can take his place." I liked my work well enough, and my paying kept my place a year, and I should have been there still if it hadn't been for a circumstance. But don't let me anticipate. Ours was a hydraulic lift, none of them rickety old things swung up like a poll parrot's cage in a whale's staircase that I shouldn't dare to trust my neck to. It ran as smooth as oil. A child might have worked it, and safe for standing on the ground. Instead of being stuck full of advertisements like an omnibus, we'd mirrors in it, and the ladies would look at themselves and pat their hairs and set their mouths when I was taking them downstairs, dressed of an evening. It was a little sitting room with red velvet cushions to sit down on, and you'd nothing to do but get into it, and it would float you up or float you down, light as a bird. All the visitors used the lift, one time or another, going up or coming down. Some of them was French, and they called the lift the ascenseur, and good enough for them in their language, no doubt. But why the Americans that can speak English when they choose, and are always finding out ways of doing things quicker than other folks, should waste time and breath calling a lift an elevator, I can't make it out. I was in charge of the lift from noon until midnight. By that time the theatre and dining out folks had come in, and anyone returning late walked upstairs, for my day's work was done. One of the porters worked the lift till I come on duty in the morning. But before 12 there was nothing particular going on, not much till after 2 o'clock. Then it was pretty hot work, with visitors coming up and down constantly, and the electric bell ringing you from floor to floor like a house on fire. Then came a quiet spell while dinner was on, and I'd sit down comfortable in the lift and read my paper. Only I mightn't smoke, but nobody else might neither, and I had to ask foreign gentlemen to please not smoke in it. It was against the rule. I hadn't so often to tell English gentlemen. They were not foreigners. That seemed as if their cigars were glued to their lips, unfortunately. Such disgusting things. I always noticed faces as folks got into the lift, for I have a sharp sight and a good memory, and none of the visitors needed to tell me twice where to take them. I knew them, and I knew their floors as well as they did themselves. It was in November that Colonel Saxby came by the Emperor Hotel. I noticed him particularly, because you could see at once that he was a soldier. He was tall and thin man about 50, with a hawk nose, keen eyes, and a grey moustache, and walked stiff from a gunshot wound to the knee. But what I noticed most was a scar of a sabre cut above the right side of his face. As he got into the lift to go to his room on the 4th floor, I thought, what a difference there is among officers. Colonel Saxby put me in mind of a telegraph post for height and thinness, and my old colonel was like a barrel in a uniform, but a brave soldier and a gentleman all the same. Colonel Saxby's number was room 210, just opposite the glass door leading to the lift, and every time I stopped on the 4th floor, number 210 stared at me in the face. The colonel used to go up in the lift every day, regular, though he never came down in it till, but I'm coming to that presently. Sometimes, when he was alone in the lift, he'd speak to me. He asked me in what regiment I'd served, and he said he knew the officers in it, but I can't say he was comfortable to talk. There was something standoffish about him, and he always seemed deep in his own thoughts. He never sat down in the lift. Whether it was empty or full, he stood bolt upright under the lamp, where the light fell on his pale face and scarred cheek. One day in February, I didn't take the Colonel up in the lift, and as he was regular as clockwork, I noticed it. But I supposed he'd gone away for a few days, and I thought no more about it. When I stopped on the 4th floor, the door of 210 was shut, and as he often left it open, I made sure the Colonel was aware. At the end of a week, I heard a chambermaid say that Colonel Saxby was ill. So, that's why he hasn't been in the lift today. It was a Tuesday night, and I had an uncommonly busy time of it. It was one stream of traffic up and down, and so it went the whole evening. It was on the strike of midnight, and I was about to put out the light in the lift, lock the door, and leave the key in the office for the man in the morning, when the electric bell rang out sharp. I looked at the dial, and saw I was wanted on the 4th floor. It struck 12 as I stepped into the lift. As I passed the 2nd and 3rd floors, I wondered who it was that had rung so late, and thought it must be a stranger that didn't know the rule of the house. But when I stopped at the 4th floor and flung open the door of the lift, Colonel Saxby was standing there, wrapped in a military cloak. The door of his room was shut behind him, for I read the number on it. I thought he was ill in bed, and ill enough he looked, but he had his hat on, and what could a man that had been in bed 10 days want with going out on a winter midnight? I don't think he saw me, but when I'd set the lift in motion, I looked at him, standing under the lamp, with the shadow of his hat hiding his eyes, and the full light on the lower part of his face. That was deadly pale, the scar on his cheek showing still paler. "Glad to see you're better, sir," said I, but he said nothing, and I didn't like the look at him. He stood like a statue with his cloak about him, and I was downright glad I opened the door of the lift for him to step out into the hall. I saluted as he got out, and he went past me towards the front door. "The Colonel wants to go out," I said to the porter, who stood staring, and he opened the door, and Colonel Saxby walked out into the snow. "That's a queer go," he said. "It is," I said. "I don't like the Colonel's looks. He doesn't seem himself at all. He's ill enough to be in his bed, and there he is gone out on a night like this. Anyhow, he's got a famous cloak to keep him warm. I say, supposing he's going to a fancy ball and got that cloak on to hide his dress," said the porter, laughing uneasily, for we both felt queerer than we cared to say. And as we spoke, there came a loud ring at the doorbell. "No more passengers for me," I said, and I was really putting the light out this time, when Joe opened the door, and 2 gentlemen entered that I knew at a glance were doctors. One was tall, and the other was short and stout, and they both came to the lift. "Sorry, gentlemen." "Oh, not at all, sir, but it is against the rules for the lift to go up after midnight." "Nonsense," said the stout gentleman. "It's only past 12, and a matter of life and death. Take us up at once to the 4th floor." And they were in the lift like a shot, so up we went, and when I opened the door, they walked straight to number 210. A nurse came out to meet them, and the stout doctor asked, "No change for the worse, I hope?" I heard her reply, "The patient died 5 minutes ago, sir." Though I'd no business to speak, that was more than I could stand. I followed the doctors to the door and said, "There's some mistake here, gentlemen. I took the Colonel down in the lift since the clock struck 12, and he went out." The stout doctor said sharply, "A case of mistaken identity. It was someone else who you took to the Colonel." "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, it was the Colonel himself, and the night porter that opened the front door for him knew him as well as me. He was dressed for a night like this, with his military cloak wrapped round him. "Step in and see for yourself," said the nurse. I followed the doctor into the room, and there lay Colonel Saxby, looking just as I had seen him a few minutes before. There he lay, dead as his forefathers, and the great cloak spread over the bed to keep him warm, that would feel heat and cold no more. I never slept that night. I sat up with Joe, expecting every minute to hear the Colonel ring the front doorbell. Next day, every time the door for the lift rang sharp and sudden, the sweat broke out on me, and I shook again. I felt as bad as I did the first time I was in action. Me and Joe told the manager all about it, and he said we'd been dreaming. But he said, "Mind you don't talk about it, or the house will be empty in a week." The Colonel's coffin was smuggled into the house the next night. The manager and I and the undertaker's men took it up in the lift, and it lay right across it, and not an inch to spare. They carried it into number 210, and while I waited for them to come out again, a queer feeling came over me. The door opened softly, and 4 men carried out the long coffin straight across the passage, and set it down with its foot towards the door of the lift. The manager looked around for me. "I can't do it, sir," I said. "I can't take the Colonel down again. I took him down at midnight yesterday, and that was enough for me." "Push it in," said the manager, speaking short and sharp. They ran the coffin into the lift without a sound. The manager got in last. Before he closed the door, he said, "Mole, you've worked this lift for the last time, it strikes me." And I had, for I wouldn't have stayed at the Empire Hotel after what had happened. Not if you'd double my wages. And me and the night porter, we left together. I hope you enjoyed that tale. Our next one shall be, I believe, On the Water by Guy de Maupassant. It has been translated from French, I believe, is the native language. And it is good to see everybody. I hope you're all enjoying this. I do hope. If you guys do enjoy this, we shall keep this up until Halloween night, if possible. Every week. If not, please, please, please make your comments now, and we can figure it out later. Let's see here. Where did it go, the bloody bookmark? Ah, there it is. Apologies. On the Water by Guy de Maupassant, translated from the French by Bill Bowers. I had rented last summer a little country house on the banks of the Seine several leagues from Paris. I went there to sleep every night. After a few days, I made the acquaintance of one of my neighbours, a man between 30 and 40, who was certainly the most curious fellow I had ever met. He was an old hand at boating, passionate about boating, always near the water, always on the water, always in the water. He must have been born in a boat, and he would certainly die in a boat. One night, while we were walking together on the bank of the Seine, I asked him to tell me some stories about his life on the water, and at that the good man suddenly became animated, transfigured, eloquent, and most poetical. He had to have in his heart one great passion, devouring and irresistible: the river. "Ah," he said to me, "how many memories I have of that river you see flowing there near us. You people who live on streets, you don't know what the river is. But just listen to a fisherman simply pronouncing that word. For him it is the thing mysterious, profound, unknown, the place of mirage and phantasmagoria, where one sees at night things that do not exist, where one hears unfamiliar noises. where one trembles without knowing why, as though crossing a cemetery. And it is indeed the most sinister of cemeteries, a cemetery where there are no tombs. To the fisherman, the land seems limited, but in the dark, when there is no moon, the river seems limitless. A sailor has no such feeling for the sea. She is often hard and wicked, it's true, but she cries, she screams, she is loyal, the great sea, while the river is silent and treacherous. She never even mutters, she flows always noiselessly, and this eternal movement of flowing water is far more terrifying for me than the high seas of the ocean. Dreamers claim that the sea hides in her bosom great blue regions where the drowned roll among the great fish, in the midst of strange forests and in crystal grottos. The river has only black depths where one rots in the slime. For all that, she is beautiful when she gleams in the rising sun, or washes softly along between her banks, covered with murmuring weeds. The poet says of the ocean, "O seas, you know sad stories, deep seas feared by kneeling mothers. You tell the stories to one another at flood tides. But this is why you had such despairing voices, when at night you come towards us nearer and nearer. Well, I think the stories whispered by the slender reeds, with their soft little voices, must still be more sinister than the gloomy dramas told by the howling of the high seas. But since you ask me for some of my memories, I will tell you a singular adventure, which I had here about 10 years ago. I lived then, as I still do, in the house of the old Lady Laughton, and one of my best friends, Louis Burnet, who has not now given up his oars to join the civil service, along with his low shoes and sleeveless jersey, lived in the village of Coin. 2 leagues further down, we dined together every day, sometimes at his place, sometimes at mine. One evening, as I was returning home alone, rather tired, painfully pulling my heavy boat, a 12-footer that I always used at night, I stopped for a few seconds to catch my breath near the point where so many reeds grow, down there where 200 meters before you come to the railroad bridge. The weather was magnificent. The moon resplendent, the river gleamed, the air was calm and soft. The tranquility of it all tempted me. I told myself that it would be extremely nice to smoke a pipe just there. Action followed the thought. I seized my anchor and threw it into the river. The boat, which floated down again with the current, pulled the chain out to its full length, then stopped, and I seated myself in the stern on my sheepskin, as comfortable as possible. I heard nothing. Only sometimes I thought I caught a low, almost insensible lapping of water along the bank, and I made out a few clumps of reeds, which, taller than most, took on surprising shapes, and seemed from time to time to stir. The river was perfectly still, but I felt myself moved by the extraordinary silence which surrounded me. All the animals, the frogs and toads, those nocturnal singers of the marshes, were silent. Suddenly on my right, near me, a frog croaked. I started, it fell silent. Then I heard nothing more, and I resolved to smoke a little ways away, more as a distraction than anything. But though I am a regular blackener of pipes, I could not smoke that night. After the second puff, I sickened of it, and I stopped. I began to hum. The sound of my voice was painful to me, so I looked at the sky. For some time I remained quiet, but soon the slight movements of the boat made me uneasy. It seemed to me that it was a Ewing tremendously striking now that this river bank, and now the other. Then I thought that a being or invisible force was dragging it down, gently to the bottom. Then it was lifting it up, to let it fall again. I was tossed about, as if in the middle of a storm. I heard noises around me. I sat up with a sudden start. The water gleamed. Everything was calm. I understood that my nerves was unsettled, and I resolved to get out of here. I pulled on my chain. The boat started moving. Then I felt resistance. I pulled harder. The anchor did not come up. It had caught on something at the bottom of the river, and I could not lift it. I started pulling again in vain. So with my oars, I turned the boat upstream to change the position of the anchor. It was no use. It still held. I got angry. I shook the chain in rage. Nothing moved. I sat down discouraged and thought about my position. There was no hope of breaking the chain, or of getting it loose from my craft, because it was very heavy and riveted on the boat into a piece of wood thicker than my arm. But since the weather remained quite nice, I thought that I should doubtless not have to wait long before meeting some fisherman who would come to my rescue. My misadventures had called me. I sat down and finally was able to smoke my pipe. I had a flask of brandy with me. I drank 2 or 3 glasses. My situation made me laugh. It was very hot, so that, if need be, I could spend the night under the stars without great inconvenience. Suddenly, a little knock sounded against the side. I shivered, and a cold sweat froze me from head to toe. The noise came, no doubt, from some piece of wood drawn along by the current, but that was enough, and I felt myself again overcome by a strange nervous agitation. I seized my chain, and I stiffened myself in a desperate effort. The anchor held solidly. I sat down exhausted. Little by little, the river had become covered by a very thick, white mist, which crept very low over the water, so that standing up, I could no longer see the stream, or my feet, or my boat, and saw only the tips of the reeds, and then, beyond them, the plain, all pale in the moonlight, and with great black stains that rose into the sky, which were made by clumps of Italian poplars. I was as though wrapped to the waist in a cotton sheet of strange whiteness, and there began to come to me fantastic images. I imagined that someone was trying to climb into my boat, since I could no longer make it out, and that the river, hidden by this opaque mist, must be full of strange beings swimming around me. I experienced a horrible uneasiness. My jaws clenched, my heart beat to the point of suffocation, and losing my head, I thought of saving myself by swimming. Then, in an instant, the very idea made me shiver in fear. I saw myself lost, drifting aimlessly in this impenetrable mist, struggling among the grasses and the reeds that I would not be able to avoid, with a rattle in my throat from fear, not seeing the shore, never finding my boat again. And it seemed to me as though I felt myself being drawn by the feet down to the bottom of that black water. In fact, since I should have had to swim upstream at least 500 meters before finding a point clear of rushes and reeds, where I could regain my footing, there were 9 chances in 10 that I should lose my bearings in the fog and drown. However, I was not a good swimmer. I tried to reason with myself. I realized that my will was firmly enough resolved to be fearless, and the current wasn't that strong. But there was something in me besides my will, and this other thing was afraid. I asked myself what it could be that I dreaded. What part of me that was courageous riled at that part of me that was cowardly? And I had never understood so well before the opposition between those 2 beings, which exist only within myself, the one willing, the other resisting, and each in turn the master. This stupid and inexplicable fear kept growing until it became terror. I remained motionless, eyes wide open with a straining and expectant ear. Expecting what? I did not know, but only that it had to be terrible. I'm sure that if a fish, as often happens, had felt like jumping out of the water, it would have taken only that to make me faint and fall flat on my back. Finally, by a violent effort, I very nearly recovered the reason which had been escaping me. I again took my brandy flask and drank from it in great gulps. Then an idea came to me, and I began to shout with all my might, turning in succession towards all 4 points of the horizon. Then, when my throat was at last completely paralyzed, I listened. A dog was howling, a very long way off. I drank again, and stretched out on my back in the bottom of the boat. I stayed that way for an hour, perhaps 2, without sleeping, my eyes wide open, with nightmares all around me. I did not dare to sit up, and yet I had a wild desire to do so. So I kept putting it off from minute to minute. I would say to myself, "Come on, get up." And I was afraid to move. At last I raised myself with infinite precaution, as if life depended on the slightest sound I might make, and I peered over the edge of the boat. I was dazzled by the most marvellous and the most astounding spectacle that it is possible to see. It was one of those phantasmagoras from fairyland, one of those visions told by travellers returning from far away, in which we hear without believing them. The mist, which 2 hours before was floating over the water, had little by little withdrawn and piled itself upon the banks, leaving the river absolutely clear. It had formed along each shore long, low hills about 6 to 7 meters high, which gleamed beneath the moon with the brilliance of snow, so that one saw nothing except this river of fire between 2 white mountains, and up there, high, high above my head, a great luminous moon, full and large, glowed in the blue milky sky. All the animals of the water had awakened. The bullfrogs croaked furiously, while from instant to instant, sometimes on my right, sometimes on my left, I heard these short, mournful, sad notes that the brassy voices of the marsh frogs directed at the sky. Strangely enough, I was no longer afraid. I was in the midst of such an extraordinary landscape that the most unusual things could not have astonished me. How long this sight lasted I do not know, because at last I had grown drowsy. When I again opened my eyes, the moon had set, the sky was full of clouds, the water lashed mournfully, the wind whispered, it grew cold, and the darkness was profound. I drank all the brandy I had left. Then I listened, shivering to the rustling of the reeds, and to the sinister noise of the river. I tried to see, but I could not make out my boat, or even my own hands, though I brought them close to my eyes. Little by little, however, the density of the blackness diminished. Suddenly, I thought I felt a shadow slipping along near me. I cried out. A voice replied. It was a fisherman. I hailed him. He approached, and I told him of my misadventure. He pulled his boat alongside, and both of us heaved on the chain. The anchor did not budge. The day was coming on, sombre, grey, rainy, cold, one of those days that always brought sorrow and misfortune. I made out another craft. We hailed it. The man aboard joined us in our efforts. Then, little by little, the anchor yielded. It came up slowly, and weighted down by something very, very heavy. At last we made out a black mass, and pulled it alongside. It was the corpse of an old woman, with a great stone weighted around her neck. And all 3 of these stories were from classic ghost stories, edited by Bill Bowers. Lovely read for those of you looking for a good chilling story. Welcome to those of you who are just joining. As you can see, this is not like the other streams. Today's the day that Sans decided that Grillby deserves a break. Especially when that break entails his tab being lowered just a little bit. And now I must ask, what did each of you think of those tales? For those of you that were here from the beginning, from those of you who just joined, how are you enjoying yourselves? Because the next story goes from creepy to a little bit silly. It is called The Problem with PR. That is from the book called Bloodlight, which is a nice little book thrown out by the Horror Writers Association. Now let's see here. There's the bookmark. And yes, I am actually reading from books, as archaic and odd as that might be to those who grew up with only technology. It is indeed a book. Ah, welcome back home then. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Dragon. Please do not fall down. We don't need you falling down and injuring yourself. The next story is PR Problems by Eric James Stone. What annoys me the most about vampires and werewolves is their good PR. Not that I want to return to the days of villagers with pitchforks and torches, but all the romantic attachment to predators who hunt and kill humans makes me sick. So when a cannibalistic serial killer started leaving the gnawed-on bones of his victims in public places, did the media label him a vampire? No. A werewolf? No. The press called him the Grove City Ghoul. Those reporters had obviously never heard of fact-checking. First, we ghouls are carrion eaters, not predators. Hyenas, not wolves. Sure, we like to feast on human flesh, but we find bodies that are already dead and eat them, after they've had a chance to decay a bit. For some inexplicable reason, people seem to think that's more grotesque than the actual killings by vampires or werewolves. Second, a ghoul wouldn't just gnaw on the bones, he would eat them. Besides being nice and crunchy, they're a good source of calcium. That's why ghouls never suffer from osteoporosis. We ghouls just have bad PR, and the serial killer wasn't helping. But what could I do about it? I worked as a property manager for high-rise apartment complexes. Vampires might whine till daybreak about how their undead lives sucked, but it was vampires and werewolves who got the really cool jobs, like private detective or radio talk show host. My crime-fighting experience was limited to stuff like catching the Nelson kids from apartment 4C spray painting graffiti in the parking lot, while my radio experience consisted of listening, not talking. And that's what I was doing the morning after the police found the 6th victim's bones, listening to the news on the radio while I mopped the floor of the lobby. I was relieved when Olga Krasny from 8A came in the front door. Olga worked the night shift as a nurse, and from what I heard on the radio, all the serial killer's victims either worked or went to school at night. Each victim, except the first, had been taken the night after bones from the previous victim were found, which meant another victim would have been taken last night. "Hey, Mr. Osney," said Olga. "My kitchen faucet is leaky again." If I were a vampire or werewolf, the moment would have been filled with sexual tension. Olga would be a slinky Swedish nurse rather than a stout Ukrainian one, and my kitchen faucet has the leaky would be a euphemism for passion, desire. I'll come take a look when I finish here, I said. In this case, a leaky faucet was just a leaky faucet. With 48 apartments in the building, something was always breaking somewhere. Vampires and werewolves, I was fairly certain, didn't mop floors or fix faucets. To my surprise, Olga's kitchen faucet did not, in fact, have the leaky. But she wasn't trying to seduce me. She was merely wrong about the source of the leak. The water had been coming through the wall under the sink from the kitchen of apartment 8B. I knocked on the door of 8B and waited for Harvey Tanner to respond. Harvey seemed like a nice, quiet young man, which is always how the neighbors of serial killers inevitably describe them on TV after they are arrested. That didn't mean anything, of course. My neighbors would probably describe me the same way, and I'd never killed anyone. I knocked a couple more times, but there was still no answer. Under the lease agreement, an ongoing water leak was sufficient reason for me to use my master key and enter without the renter's permission. So I did. As I got to the kitchen, I could smell the faint but tasty aroma of rotting human flesh. I might not have enhanced senses like a vampire or werewolf, but my ghoulish nose was pretty good at sniffing out potential food. I wondered for a moment if maybe Harvey had died somehow, and then I remembered I'd seen him yesterday, and what I smelled was more decayed than would happen in less than 24 hours. I walked over to the sink and opened the cupboard door, so I could access the water shut-off valve. I turned off the water to stop the leak, and that's when I spotted the scraps on the floor. 3 strips, each about an inch long, 1/4 of an inch wide, slightly rounded like cheese that had been through the grater. I sniffed at the scraps. They were not cheese, but they were quite tasty. Maybe Harvey had accidentally grated bits of himself while cooking dinner. But I had my doubts. Unfortunately, I didn't think about the fact that those scraps might be evidence until after I ate them. I burped, considered what to do next. I couldn't call the police without any evidence, so I decided to see if Harvey had any skeletons in his closet. Literally. All the apartments in the buildings have 2 bedrooms. Harvey lived alone, so I wondered what he used the extra bedroom for. I opened the door. The room's windows were covered, so that no light came in from the outside. I flicked the light switch on, and was startled to see a young woman, gagged and tied to a folding metal chair in the middle of the room. She swung her head up to look at me, her eyes wild with panic. Then someone grabbed me from behind and shoved a chemical-smelling cloth over my mouth and nose. One of the more ridiculous myths about ghouls is that we are undead creatures. Just because we hang out around graveyards a lot doesn't mean we're undead. We're merely going where the food is. Would you assume someone was Italian just because he hangs out at a pizza parlor? Of course, in this case, the disadvantage of not being undead was that after struggling to breathe, I sank into unconsciousness. When I came to, I found myself in the same room, sitting on a chair. A piece of towel had been stuffed into my mouth, held in place by more cloth tied around my head. And I had to work hard to keep myself from gagging on the gag. My wrists were bound tightly together behind the back of the chair. My feet were tied quite thoroughly to the bottom. The young woman was watching me from her chair. It would be hard for me to free myself without showing my true nature, and I was afraid that might freak her out. On the other hand, she had been kidnapped by a serial killer, so how much more freaked out could she get? I want to make it clear that just because I can transform myself into a hyena does not mean I am a were-hyena. We ghouls have a long and proud tradition of being able to morph into hyenas. You can look that up on Wikipedia, although the article is inaccurate in many other respects. And unlike lycanthropes, we're not infectious. I really don't understand what the werewolves have to be proud of. Anyone can become a werewolf just by being bitten by one. Essentially, lycanthropy spreads like rabies. We ghouls, on the other hand, reproduce in the normal human fashion. My family can trace its lineage back to the ancient Persian Empire. In all modesty, though, the ability to become a hyena isn't very impressive. It's useful for feeding, because those hyena jaws are strong enough to bite through bone. But the hyena? really doesn't get a lot of respect. Take the Lion King, for instance. The hyenas don't even get to be the real villains, merely minions for an evil lion. Thus, Hollywood continues to perpetuate the stereotype that carrion eaters are of lower status than predators. After a few minutes of struggling with my ropes, I decided that transforming was my only option. I could only hope that if the young woman told anyone about my ability, they would attribute her story to hysteria. I shapeshifted into my hyena form, since it was smaller than my human form. The ropes lessened as I transformed. As soon as I was free, I changed back to human. Let's see. From behind her gag, the young woman made a half-choking cough of incredulity. I knelt by her chair and set to work untying her. Don't worry, I'll get you out of here. Before I finished, the door opened. I rose to my feet and turned to find Harvey pointing a gun at me. If there was one thing the PR about vampires and werewolves was not overhyping, it was their magical resilience to harm. I envied that. It wouldn't take a wooden stake through the heart or a silver bullet to kill me. Plain old lead bullets would do the trick. I raised my hands in surrender. I'm sorry, Mr. Osney, Harvey said, but I couldn't have you running to the police. People might get the wrong impression. People already have the wrong impression, I said. They're calling you a ghoul when you're actually a serial killer. It's very bad PR for. I'm a vampire hunter, not a serial killer, said Harvey, pointing the gun at me. What? He motioned with his gun toward the girl. Go ahead. Check her pulse. I put my fingers to her throat. There was no heartbeat. Her skin felt cool to the touch. You really are a vampire, I said. She glared at me. So what? You're I stuffed the gag back into her mouth. So why haven't you killed her yet? I said as I backed away from her, which took me closer to Harvey and the door. I don't want the meat to go bad, he said. It's much better when you slice it off fresh. I didn't bother to express my disagreement verbally. There's no accounting for taste. Fortunately, he said, vampires stay alive a lot longer than humans after you start cutting chunks off them. How do they taste? I asked. He smiled. Much better than chicken. For a moment, as I stood next to Harvey and we both looked at the vampire, I thought he and I could come to a culinary arrangement. I could eat the bones for him. At the very least, I guess a serial killer mentality made him taunt the police by leaving the bones laying around for people to find. But it really wasn't very smart. However, before I could say anything, he added, vampire flesh isn't really human anymore. So it's not like I'm a ghoul. Being looked down on by a serial killer was the straw that broke this ghoul's back. In one smooth motion, I transformed my head into a hyena form and tore out Harvey's throat. Hey, we may not be hunters, but that doesn't mean we're not dangerous when provoked. After I untied her, the vampire and I looked at Harvey's body. I suppose I should call the police or something, I said, and let them know the serial killer is dead. Are you kidding? Said the vampire. Let's just leave him and get out of here. If I left the body for a few days, sealed up in this room, it would get nice and ripe. And unlike my usual food, it wouldn't taste of formaldehyde. My mouth watered just imagining the meal. Let's go, I said. As we got out to the living room, she grabbed my hand and pulled me close. My heart beat faster. I've heard that werewolves are the greatest lovers in the world, she said. I was about to express my annoyance at yet another example of good werewolf PR when I realized what she was implying. And despite being so dumb she couldn't tell a hyena from a wolf, she was very good looking. Yes, I said as I embraced her. Yes, we are. Again, that was a story by Eric Stone called PR Problems from the book Bloodlight. Oh dear, I believe this calls for a little bit of a drink break, so if you need a chance to get up and stretch your legs, please do so. I'm glad you're enjoying it. hopefully you're all enjoying it, just even a little bit. We need something to lessen the mood. All this dour talk of spooks and corpses found. Might as well make something funny, correct? Alright. And let us see here. The next book we shall be venturing from is called Gothic Chilling Horror Short Stories. As you can imagine, they're from the more Gothic era. And let's see here, I believe our first story is called The Yellow Sign from this one, if I'm reading my numbers correctly. Indeed, by Robert W. Chambers. Let the red dawn surmise what we shall do when this blue starlight dies and all is through. There are so many things which are impossible to explain. Why should certain chords in music make me think of the brown and golden tints of autumn foliage? Why should the Mass of Saint Cecil send my thoughts wandering among caravans whose walls blaze with ragged masses of virgin silver? What was it in the roar and turmoil of Broadway at 6 o'clock that flashed before my eyes the picture of a still Breton forest, where sunlight filtered through spring foliage, and Sylvia bent half curiously, half tenderly, over a small green lizard, murmuring to think that this is also a little ward of God. When I first saw the Watchman, his back was toward me. I looked at him indifferently until he went to the church. I paid no more attention to him than I had to any other man who lounged through Washington Square that morning, and when I shut my door and turned back into my studio, I had forgotten him. Late in the afternoon, the day being warm, I raised the window and leaned out to get a sniff of air. A man was standing in the courtyard of the church, and I noticed him again with little interest, as I had that morning. I looked across the square to where the fountain was playing, and then, with my mind filled with the vague impressions of trees, asphalt drives, and the moving groups of nursemaids and holiday-makers, I started to walk back to my easel. As I turned, my listless glance included the man below in the churchyard. His face was toward me now, and with a perfectly involuntary movement, I bent to see it. At the same moment he raised his head and looked at me. Instantly I thought of a coffin worm. Whenever it was about the man that repelled me, I did not know, but the impression of a plump, white grave worm was so intense and nauseating that I must have shown it on my expression, for he turned his puffy face away with a movement which made me think of a disturbed grub in a chestnut. I went back to my easel and motioned the model to resume her pose. After working a while, I was satisfied that I was spoiling what I had done as rapidly as possible. I took up a palette knife and scraped the colour out again. The flesh tones were sallow and unhealthy. I did not understand how I could have painted such a sickly colour into a study, which before there had glowed with healthy tones. I looked at Tessie. She had not changed. The clear flush of health dyed her neck and cheeks as I frowned. "Is it something I've done?" she said. "No, I've made a mess of this arm, and for the life of me I cannot see how I came to paint such mud onto this canvas." "Oh, don't I pose well?" she insisted. "Oh, of course, perfectly." "Then it is not my fault." "No, it's my own." "I'm very sorry." I told her she could rest while I applied rag and turpentine to the plague spots on my canvas, and she went off to smoke a cigarette and looked over the illustrations in the Courrier Français. I did not know whether it was something in the turpentine or a defect in the canvas, but the more I scrubbed, the more the gangrene seemed to spread. I worked like a beaver to get it out, and yet the disease appeared to creep from limb to limb of the study before me. Alarmed, I strove to arrest it, but now the colour on the breast changed, and the whole figure seemed to absorb the infection as a sponge soaks up water. Vigorously I applied palette knife, turpentine, and scraper, thinking all the time what a seance I should hold with Duval, who had sold me the canvas. But soon I noticed that it was not the canvas which was defective, nor yet the colours of Edward. It must be the turpentine, I thought angrily, or else my eyes have become so blurred and confused by the afternoon light that I can't see straight. I called Tessie, the model. She came and leaned over my chair, blowing rings of smoke into the air. "Oh my, what have you done?" she exclaimed. "Nothing," I growled. "It must be this turpentine." "What a horrible colour it is now," she continued. "Do you think my flesh resembles green cheese?" No, I don't," I said angrily. "Did you ever know me to paint like that before?" "No, indeed." "Well, then." "It must be the turpentine or something," she admitted. She slipped on a Japanese robe and walked to the window. I scraped and rubbed until I was tired, then finally picked up my brushes and hurled them through the canvas with a forcible expression and tone alone of which Tessie's ears could hear. Nevertheless, she promptly began. "That's it. I swear an act silly and ruin your brushes. You have been 3 weeks in that study, and now look. What's the good of ripping the canvas? What creatures artists are!" I felt as much ashamed as I usually did after such an outbreak, and I turned to the ruined canvas on the wall. Tessie helped me clean my brushes, and then danced away to dress. From the screen she regaled me with bits of advice concerning whole or partial loss of temper, until thinking, perhaps, I had been tormented sufficiently, she came out to implore me to button her waist, which she could not reach it on the shoulder. Everything went wrong from the time you came back from the window and talked about that horrid-looking man you saw in the churchyard," she announced. "Yes, he probably bewitched the picture," I said, yawning. I looked at my watch. "It's after 6, I know," said Tessie, adjusting her hair before the mirror. "Yes," I replied. "I didn't mean to keep you so long." I leaned out the window, but recoiled with disgust, for the young man with the pasty face stood below in the churchyard. Tessie saw my gesture of disapproval and leaned from the window. "Is that the man you don't like?" she whispered. I nodded. "I can't see his face, but he looks so fat and soft. Some way or other," she continued, looking at me, "he reminds me of a dream, and an awful dream I once had." Or, she mused, looking down at her shapely shoes. "Was it a dream after all?" "How should I know?" I smiled. Tessie smiled in reply. "You were in it," she said. "Or perhaps you might know something about it." Tessie, I protested. "Don't you dare flatter by saying you dream about me." "But I did," she insisted. "Shall I tell you about it?" Go ahead," I said, lighting a cigarette. Tessie leaned back on the open windowsill and began very seriously. "One night last winter I was lying in bed, thinking about nothing at all in particular. I had been posing for you, and I was tired out, and it seemed impossible for me to sleep. I heard the bells in the city ring 10, 11, and midnight. I must have fallen asleep about midnight, because I don't remember hearing the bells after that. It seemed to me that I had scarcely closed my eyes when I dreamed that something impelled me to go to the window. I rose, and raising the sash, I leaned out. 25th Street was deserted as far as I could see. I began to be afraid. Everything outside seemed so black and uncomfortable. Then the sound of wheels in the distance came to my ears, and it seemed to me as though that was what I must wait for. Very slowly the wheels approached, and finally I could make out a vehicle moving along the street. It came nearer and nearer, and whenever it passed beneath my window, I saw it was a hearse. Then, as I trembled with fear, the driver turned and looked straight at me. When I awoke, I was standing by the window, shivering with cold, but the black-plumed hearse and the driver were gone. I dreamed this dream again in March last, and again woke beside the window. Last night the dream came again. You remember how it was raining? When I woke, I was standing at the open window. My nightdress was soaked. But where did I come into the dream? I asked. You were in the coffin, but you were not dead. In the coffin? Yes. How did you know? Could you see me? No, I only knew you were there. Had you been eating Welsh were-rabbits again, or lobster salad? I began laughing, but the girl interrupted me with a frightened cry. Hello, what's up? I said as she shrank into the embrasure of the window. The man below, in the churchyard. He drove the hearse. Nonsense, I said, but Tessie's eyes were wide with terror. I went to the window and looked out. The man was gone. Calm, Tessie, I urged. Don't be foolish. You have posed too long. You are nervous. Do you think I could forget that face? She murmured. 3 times that hearse passed below my window, and every time the driver turned and looked up at me. His face was so white and soft. It looked dead. It looked as if it had been dead a long time. I induced the girl to sit down and swallow a glass of Marcella. Then I sat down beside her and tried to give her some advice. Look here, Tessie, I said. You go to the country for a week or 2, and you'll have no more dreams about hearses. You pose all day, and when night comes your nerves are upset. I can't keep this up. Then again, instead of going to bed when your day's work is done, you run off to picnics at Solstice Park, or go to the El Dorado or Coney Island, and when you come down here in the morning, you are fagged out. There was no real hearse. That was a soft-shell crab dream. She smiled faintly. What about the man in the churchyard? Oh, he's an ordinary, unhealthy, everyday creature. As true as my name is Tessie Reardon, I swear to you, Mr. Scott, that the face of the man below in the churchyard is the face of the man who drove the hearse. What of it? I said. It's an honest trade. Then you think I did see a hearse? Oh, I said diplomatically, you really did. It might not be unlikely that the man below drove it. There is nothing in that. Tessie rose, unrolled her scented handkerchief, and passed a bit of gum from the knots of the hem, placed it in her mouth. Then, drawing on her gloves, she offered me her hand with a frank, well, good night, Mr. Scott, and walked out. Apologies, needed a little bit extra acetone. The next morning, Thomas, the bellboy, brought me the Herald and a bit of news. The church next door had been sold. I thanked heaven for that. Not that being a Catholic I had any repugnance for the congregation next door, but because my nerves were shattered. By a blatant exhorter, whose every word echoed through the aisle of the church as if it had been my own rooms, and who insisted on his ahs with a nasal persistence which revolted my every instinct. Then, too, there was a fiend in human shape, an organist who reeled off some of the grand old hymns with an interpretation of his own, and I longed for the blood of a creature who could play the doxology with an amendment of minor chords, which one hears only in a quartet of very young graduates. I believe the minister was a good man, but when he bellowed, "And the Lord said unto Moses, the Lord is a man of war, the Lord in his name, my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword," I wondered how many centuries of purgatory it would take to atone for such a sin. Who brought the property? I asked Thomas. Nobody that I know, sir. They do say the gent what owns this here... Oh, I despise the Cockney accent. They do say the gent what owns this here Hamilton Flats was looking at it. He might be building more studios. I walked to the window. The young man with the unhealthy face stood in the churchyard gate. and at the mere sight of him the same overwhelming repugnance stood. "By the way, Thomas," I said, "who is that fellow down there?" Thomas sniffed. "That there worm, sir? He's night watchman at the church, sir. He makes me tired of sitting out all night on them steps looking at you insulting like. I'd punch him in his head, sir, pardon my sir. Now go on, Thomas." "One night, a-coming home with Harry, the other English boy, I sees him sitting there on some steps. We had Molly and Jen with us, sir, the two girls on the tray service, and he looks so insulting at us that I up and says, 'What you looking at for, you fat slug?' Beg pardon, sir, but that's how I says it, sir. Then he don't say nothing, and I says, 'Come out,' and I punch that pudding head. Then I opens the gate and goes in, but he don't do nothing, only looks insulting like. Then I hits him one, but his head was like that cold mushy. It's sick if you touch him, sir." "What did he do then?" I asked curiously. "Him? Nothing." "And you, Thomas?" The young fellow flushed in embarrassment and smiled uneasily. "Mr. Scott, sir, I'm no coward, and I can't make it out at all why I run. I was at the 5th Lancers, sir, bugler at Tel el-Kebir, and was shot by the whales." "You don't mean to say you ran away?" "I did, sir. I ran." "Why?" "That's just what I want to know, sir. I grabbed Molly and ran, and the rest of us just as frightened as I." "But what were you frightened at?" Thomas refused to answer for a while, and now my curiosity was aroused about the repulsive young man below, and I pressed him. 3 years' sojourn in America had not only modified Thomas's Cockney dialect, but had given him the American's fear of ridicule. "You won't believe me, Mr. Scott, sir." "Yes, I will." "You will laugh at me, sir." "Nonsense." He hesitated. "Well, sir, it's God's truth that when I hit him, it grabbed me wrist, sir, and when I twisted his soft mushy fist, one of his fingers come off in me hand." The utter loathing and horror on Thomas's face must have been reflected in my own, for he added, "It's awful, and now, when I see him, I just go away. It makes me ill." When Thomas had gone, I went to the window. The man stood behind the church railing with both hands on the gate, but I hastily retreated to my easel again, sickened and horrified. I saw that the middle finger of his right hand was missing. At 9 o'clock, Tessie appeared, and I vanished behind the screen with a merry "Good morning, Mr. Scott." While she had reappeared and taken her pose upon the modern stand, I started a new canvas, much to her delight. She remained silent as long as I was on the drawing, but as soon as the scrape of charcoal ceased, and I looked up my fixative, she began to chatter. "Oh, I had such a lovely time last night. We went to Tony's pastor's." "Who are we?" I demanded. "Oh, Maggie, you know, Mr. White's model, and Pinky McCormick. We call her Pinky, 'cause she's got that beautiful red hair you artists like so much, and Lizzie Burke." I sent a shower of fixative over the canvas and said, "Well, go on then." "Well, Kelly and Baby Barnes, the skirt dancer, and all the rest. I made a mash." "Then you had gone back on me, Tessie." She laughed and shook her head. "He's Lizzie Burke's brother, Ed. He's a perfect gentleman." I felt constrained to give her some parental advice concerning mashing, which she took with a bright smile. "Oh, I can take care of a strange mash," she said, examining her chewing gum. "But Ed is different. Lizzie is my best friend." Then she related how Ed had come back from the stocking mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, to find her and Lizzie grown up, and what an accomplished young man he was, and how he thought nothing of squandering $50 for ice cream and oysters to celebrate his entry as clerk into the woolen department of Macy's. Before she finished, I began to paint, and she resumed the pose, smiling and chattering like a sparrow. By noon I had the study fairly well rubbed in. and Tessie came to look at it. "Oh, now that's better," she said. I thought it was so too, and ate my lunch with a satisfied feeling that all was going well. Tessie spread her lunch on the drawing-room table opposite me, and we drank our claret from there, and lit our cigarettes from the same match. It was very much attached to Tessie. I had watched her shoot up into a slender but exquisitely formed woman from a frail, awkward child. She had posed for me the last 3 years, and among all my models, she was my favourite. It would have troubled me very much indeed had she become tough, or fly, as the phrase goes, but I had never noticed any deterioration of her manner, and felt at heart that she was all right. She and I never discussed morals at all, and I had no intention of doing so, partly because I had none myself, and partly because I knew she would do what she liked in spite of me. Still, I did hope she would steer clear of complications, because I wished her well, and then also I had a selfish desire to retain the best model I had. I knew that mashing, as she termed it, had no significance with girls like Tessie, and that such things in America did not resemble in the least the same things in Paris. Yet, having lived with my eyes open, I also knew that somebody would take Tessie away some day, in one manner or another. And though I professed to myself that marriage was nonsense, I sincerely hoped that, in this case, there would be a priest at the end of the vista. I am a Catholic. When I listen to the High Mass, when I sign myself, I feel that everything, including myself, is more cheerful, and when I confess, it does me good. A man who lives as much alone as I do must confess to somebody. Then again, Sylvia was a Catholic, and it was reason enough for me. But I was speaking of Tessie, which is very different. Tessie also was Catholic, and much more devout than I, so taking it all in, I had little fear for my pretty model until she should fall in love. But then I knew that fate alone would be decided for her future, and I prayed inwardly that fate would keep her away from men like me, and throw into her path nothing but Ed Burkes and Jimmy McCormicks. Bless her sweet face. Tessie sat blowing smoke up into the ceiling and tinkling the ice in a tumbler. "Do you know, kid, that I also had a dream last night?" I observed. I sometimes called her the kid. "Oh, not about that man," she laughed. "Exactly. A dream similar to yours. Only much worse." It was foolish and thoughtless of me to say this, but you know how little tact the average painter has. "I must have fallen asleep about 10 o'clock, I continued, "and after a while I dreamt that I awoke. So plainly did I hear the midnight bells, the wind in the tree branches, and the whistle of streamers from the bay, that even now I can scarcely believe that I was not awake. I seemed to be lying in a box which had a glass cover. Dimly I saw the street lamps as I passed, for I must tell you, Tessie, the box in which I reclined appeared to lie in a cushioned wagon, which jolted me over a stony pavement. After a while I became impatient, and tried to move, but the box was so narrow. My hands were crossed on my breast, and I could not raise them to help myself. I listened, then tried to call. My voice was gone. I could hear the trample of horses attached to the wagon, even the breathing of the driver. Then another sound broke upon my ears, like the rising of the wind sash. I managed to turn my head a little, and found I could not look. But also through the glass panes in the side of the covered vehicle, I saw houses, empty and silent, with neither light nor life about any of them, except one. In that house a window was open in the first floor, and a figure all in white stood down into the street. It was you, Tessie. It was you." Tessie had turned her face away from me, and leaned on the table with her elbow. "I could see your face," I resumed, "and it seemed to me to be very sorrowful. Then we passed on, and turned into a narrow black lane. Presently the horses stopped. I waited and waited, closing my eyes with fear and impatience. But all was silent as the grave. After what seemed to me hours, I began to feel uncomfortable. I sensed that somebody was close to me with my unclosed eyes. I saw the white face of the hearse driver looking at me through the coffin lid. A sob from Tessie interrupted me. She was trembling like a leaf. I saw I had made an ass of myself and attempted to repair the damage. "Why, Tess," I said, "I only told you this to show you what influence your story might have had on another person's dreams. You don't suppose I really lay in a coffin, do you? What are you trembling for? Don't you see that your dream and my unreasonable dislike for that inoffensive watchman of the church simply set my brain working as soon as I fell asleep?" She laid her head between her arms and sobbed as if her heart would break. What a precious triple donkey I had made of myself. I was about to break my record. I went over and put an arm about her. "Tessa, dear, forgive me. I had no business to frighten you with such nonsense. You are too sensible a girl, too good a Catholic to believe in dreams." Her hand tightened in mine, and her head fell back upon my shoulder. But she still trembled, and I petted her and comforted her. "Come, Tess, open your eyes and smile." Her eyes opened, with a slow, languid movement, and met mine, but their expression was so queer that I hastened to reassure her again. "It's all humbug, Tess. You surely are not afraid that any harm will come to you because of that?" "No," she said, and her scarlet lips quivered. "Then what's the matter? Are you afraid?" "Yes, not for myself." "For me, then?" I demanded gaily. "For you," she murmured in a voice almost inaudible. I care for you." At first I started to laugh, and when I understood her, a shock passed through me, and I sat like one turned to stone. This was the crowning bit of idiocy I had committed. During the moment which had elapsed between her reply and my answer, I thought of 1,000 responses to that innocent confession. I could pass it by with a laugh. I could misunderstand her and reassure her to my health. I could simply point out that was impossible. She could love me. But my reply was quicker than my thoughts, and I might think now when I was too late, for I'd kissed her on her mouth. That evening I took my usual walk in Washington Park, pondered over the occurrences of the day. I was thoroughly committed. There was no back out now, and I stared the future straight in the face. I was not good, not even scrupulous, but I had no idea of deceiving either myself or Tessie. The one passion of my life lay buried in the sunlit forests of Brittany. Was it buried forever? Hope cried, "No!" For 3 years I had been listening to the voice of hope, and for 3 years I had waited for a footstep on my threshold. Had Sylvia forgotten? "No!" Hope cried. I said that I was not good. That is true, but still I was not exactly a comic opera villain. I had led an easy-going, reckless life, taken what invited me of pleasure, deploring and sometimes bitterly regretting consequences. In one thing alone, except my painting, I was serious, and that was something which lay hidden, if not lost, in the Breton forests. It was too late now for me to regret what had occurred during the day, whatever it had been, pity, a sudden tenderness for sorrow, or more brutal instinct of gratified vanity. It was all the same now, and unless I wished to bruise an innocent heart, my path lay marked before me. The fire and strength, the depth of passion of love, which I had never even suspected, with all my imagined experience in the world, left me no alternative but to respond or send her away. Whether because I was so cowardly about giving pain to others, or whether it was that I have little of the gloomy Puritan in me, I do not know, but I shrank from disclaiming responsibility for that thoughtless kiss, and in fact had no time to do so before the gates of her heart opened, and the flood poured forth. Others who habitually do their duty, and find a sullen satisfaction in making themselves and everyone else unhappy, might have withstood it. I did not. I dared not. After the storm had abated, I did tell her that she might better have loved Ed Burke, and worn a plain gold ring, but she would not hear of it. I thought perhaps that was as long as she had decided to love somebody she could not marry. It had better been me. I, at least, could treat her with an intelligent affection, and whenever she became tired of her infatuation, She could go none the worse for it, pardon the stutter, for I was decided on that point. Although I knew how hard it would be, I remembered the unusual termination of platonic liaisons, and thought how disgusted I had been whenever I heard of one. I knew I was undertaking a great deal for so unscrupulous a man as I was, and I dreaded the future. But never for a moment did I doubt that she was safe with me. Had it been anybody but Tessie, I should not have bothered my head about scruples, for it did not occur to me to sacrifice Tessie, as I would have sacrificed a woman of the world. I looked the future squarely in the face, and saw the several probable endings to the affair. She would either tire of the whole thing, or become so unhappy that I should have either to marry her or go away. If I married her, we would be unhappy. I with a wife unsuited to me, and she with a husband unsuited for any woman. For my past life could scarcely entitle me to marry. If I went away, she might either fall ill, recover, marry some Eddie Burke, or she might recklessly or deliberately go and do something foolish. On the other hand, if she tired of me, then her whole world would be before her with beautiful vistas of Eddie Burkes, and marriage rings, and twins, and Harlem flats, and heaven knows what. As I strolled along through the trees by Washington Arch, I decided that she should find a substantial friend, in me anyway, and the future could take care of itself. Then I went into the house, and put on my evening dress, for the little faintly perfumed note on my dress said, "Have a cab at the stage door at 11, and the note was signed, Edith. I took supper that night, or rather, we took supper, Miss Carmichael and I, our solares, and the dawn was just beginning to gild in the cross of the Memorial Church as I entered Washington Square after leaving Edith at the Brunswick. There was not a soul in the park as I passed among the trees and took the walk which leads from the Garibaldi statue to the Hamilton apartment house, but as I passed the churchyard, I saw figures sitting on the stone steps. In spite of myself, a chill crept over me at the sight of the white puffy face, and I hastened to pass. Then he said something, which might have been addressed to me, or might merely have been a mutter to himself, but a sudden, furious anger flamed within me that such a creature should address me. For an instant, I felt like wheeling about and smashing my stick over his head, but I walked on, and into the Hamilton, went to my apartment. For some time I tossed about the bed, trying to get the sound of his voice out of my ears, but could not. It filled my head, that muttering sound, that thick, oily smoke from a fat-rending vat, or an odour of noisome decay, and as I lay and tossed about, the voice in my ear seemed more distinct. I began to understand the words he muttered. They came to me, slowly, as if I'd forgotten them. And at last I could make some sense out of the sounds. Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign? I was furious. What did he mean by that? Then, with a curse upon him and his, I rolled over and went to sleep. And when I awoke later, I looked pale and haggard, for I had dreamed the dream of the night before, and it troubled me more than I cared to think. I dressed and went down to my studio. Tessie sat by the window, but as I came in, she rose and put both arms around my neck in an innocent kiss. She looked so sweet and dainty that I kissed her again, and then sat down before the easel. "Hello? Where's the study I began yesterday?" I asked. Tessie looked conscious, but did not answer. I began to hunt among the pile of canvases, saying, "Hurry up, Tess, and get ready. We must take advantage of the morning light." When at last I gave up the search among the other canvases, and turned to look around the room for the missing study, I noticed Tessie standing by the screen with her clothing still on. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Don't you feel well?" "Yes." "Then hurry." "Do you want me to pose as I have always posed?" Then I understood. Here was a new complication. I had lost, of course, the best nude model I had ever seen. I looked at Tessie. Her face was scarlet. Alas, alas, we had eaten of the tree of knowledge, and Eden and native innocence were dreams of the past. I mean, for her at least. I suppose she noticed the disappointment on my face, for she said, "I will pose, if you wish. The study is behind the screen, where I put it." "No," I said, "we will begin something new." I went to my wardrobe and picked out a Moorish costume fairly blazed with tinsel. It was a genuine costume, and Tessie retired to the screen with it enchanted. When she came forth again, I was astonished. Her long black hair was bound above the forehead with a circlet of turquoises, and the ends curled with a glittering girdle. Her feet were encased in an embroidered pointed slipper, and the skirt of the costume, curiously wrought with arabesques in silver, fell to her ankles. The deep metallic blue vest embroidered with silver, and the short Maresque jacket, spangled and sewn with turquoises, became her wonderfully. She came to me and held up her face, smiling. I slipped my hand into my pocket, and drawing out a gold chain with the cross attached, dropped it over her head. "It's yours, Tessie." "Mine," she faltered. "Yours. Now go and pose." Then, with a radiant smile, she ran behind the screen and presently reappeared with a little box, on which was written my name. "I had intended to give it to you when I went home tonight," she said, "but I can't wait now." I opened the box. On the pink cotton inside lay a clasp of black onyx, on which was inlaid a curious symbol or letter in gold. It was neither Arabic nor Chinese, nor, as I found afterward, did it belong to any human script. "It's all I had to give you for a keepsake," she said timidly. I was annoyed, but told her how much I should prize it, and promised to wear it always. She fastened it on my coat beneath the lapel. "How foolish, Tess, to go and buy me such a beautiful thing as this," I said. "I did not buy it," she laughed. "Where did you get it?" Then she told me how she found it one day while coming from the aquarium in the Battery, how she had advertised it and watched the papers, but at last gave up all hopes of finding the owner. "That was last winter, the very day I had the first horrid dream about the hearse." I remembered my dream of the previous night, but said nothing. Presently my charcoal was flying over a new canvas, and Tessie stood motionless on the model stand. The following day was a disastrous one for me. While moving a framed canvas from one easel to another, my foot slipped on the polished floor, and I fell heavily on both wrists. They were so badly sprained that it was useless to attempt to hold a brush, and I was obliged to wander about the studio, glaring at unfinished drawings and sketches, until despair seized me, and I sat down to smoke and twiddle my thumbs with rage. The rain blew against the windows, and rattled on the roof of the church, driving me into a nervous fit with its interminable patter. Tessie sat sewing by the window, and every now and then raised her head and looked at me with such innocent compassion that I began to feel ashamed of my irritation, and looked about for something to occupy me. I had read all the papers and all the books in the library, but for the sake of something to do, I went to the bookcase and shoved them open with my elbow. I knew every volume by its colour, and examined them all, passing slowly around the library, and whistling to keep up my spirits. I was turning to go into the dining room, when my eye fell upon a book bound in yellow, standing in the corner of the top shelf of the last bookcase. I did not remember it, and from the floor could not decipher the pale lettering on the back, so I went to the smoking room and called Tessie. She came in from the studio and climbed to reach the book. "What is it?" I asked. "The King in Yellow." I was dumbfounded. Who had placed it here? How came it to my room? I had long ago decided that I should never open that book, and nothing on earth could have persuaded me to buy it. Fearful lest curiosity might tempt me to open it, but I never even looked at it in the bookstores. If I ever had any curiosity to read it, the awful tragedy of a young Castanet who I knew prevented me from exploring the wicked pages. I had always refused to listen to any description of it, and indeed nobody ever ventured to discuss the second part aloud. So I had absolutely no knowledge of what those leaves might reveal. I stared at the poisonous yellow binding as I would a snake. "Don't touch it, Tessie. Come down." Of course, my admonition was enough to arouse her curiosity, and before I could prevent it, she took the book, and laughing danced away into the studio with it. I called for her to bring it back, and she slipped away, with a tormenting smile at my helpless hands, and I followed her with some impatience. "Tessie," I cried, entering the library, "listen, I am serious. Put that book away. I do not wish you to open it." The library was empty. I went into both drawing rooms, then into the bedrooms, laundry, kitchen, and finally returned to the library and began a systematic search. She had hidden herself so well that it was half an hour later when I discovered her crouching white and silent by the lattice window in the storeroom above. At the first glance I saw she had been punished for her foolishness. The King in Yellow lay at her feet, and the book was open to the second part. I looked at Tessie and saw it was too late. She had opened the King in Yellow. Then I took her by the hand and led her into the studio. She seemed dazed, and when I told her to lie down on the sofa she obeyed me without a word. After a while she closed her eyes, her breathing became regular and deep, and I could not determine whether or not she slept. For a long while I sat silent beside her, and she neither stirred nor spoke, and at last I rose, and entering the unused storeroom, took the yellow book in my hand. It seemed heavy as lead, and I carried it into the studio again, sitting down on the rug beside the sofa, opened it, and read it through from beginning to end. When, faint with the excess of my emotions, I dropped the volume and leaned wearily back against the sofa. Tessie opened her eyes and looked at me. We had been speaking for some time in a dull, monotonous strain, before I realized that we were discussing the King in Yellow. Oh, the sin of writing such words, words which are clear as crystal, limpid and musical as bubble springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisoned diamond of Mecadus. Oh, the wickedness, the hopelessness, the damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyze human creatures with such words, words understood by the ignorant and wise alike, words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than heavenly music, more awful than death itself. We talked, unmindful of the gathering shadows, and she was begging me to throw away the clasp of yellow onyx quaintly inlaid with what we now knew to be the yellow sign. I never shall know why I refused, though even at this hour, here in my bedroom, as I write this confession, I should be glad to know what it was that prevented me from tearing the yellow sign from my breast and casting it into the fire. I am sure I wished to do so, but Tessie pleaded with me in vain. Night fell and hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the king and the pallid mask, and midnight sounded from the misty spires in the fog-warped city. We spoke of Hoster and of Cassilda, while outside the fog rolled against the blank window panes as the clouds rolled and brake on the shores of Halley. The house was very silent now, and not a sound from the misty streets broke the silence. Tessie lay among the cushions, her face a grey blot in the gloom. Her hands were clasped in mine, and I knew that she knew, and read my thoughts as I read hers, for we had understood the mystery of Hades, and the phantom of truth was laid. Then, as we answered each other swiftly, silently, thought on thought, the shadows stirred in the gloom above us, and far in the distant streets we heard a sound. Nearer and nearer it came, the dull crunching of wheels, nearer, nearer, and yet nearer. And now, outside the door, it ceased, and I dragged myself to the window and saw a black-plumed hearse. The gate below opened and shut, and I crept shaking to my door and bolted it. But I knew no bolts, no locks, could keep that creature out, who was coming for the yellow sign. And now I heard him moving softly, very softly along the hall. Now he was at the door, the bolts rotted at his touch. Now he was entering. With my eyes staring from my head, I peered into the darkness, and when he came into the room, I did not see him. It was only when I felt him envelope me in his soft, cold grasp that I cried out and struggled with deadly fury, but my hands were useless, and he tore the onyx clasps from my coat and struck me full in the face. Then, as I fell, I heard Tessie's soft cry, and her spirit fled to God. Even while falling, I longed to follow her, for I knew that the King in Yellow had opened his tattered mantle, and there was only Christ to cry to now. I could tell more, but I cannot see what help it would be to the world. As for me, I am past human help, or hope, as I lie here writing, careless even whether or not I die before I finish. I can see the doctor gathering up his powders and vials, with a vague gesture to the good priest beside me, which I understood. They will be very curious to know the tragedy. They of the outside world who write books and print millions of newspapers. But I will write no more, and the Father Confessor will seal my last words with the seal of sanctity when his holy office is done. They of the outside world may send their creatures into wrecked homes and death-smitten firesides, and their newspapers will batten on blood and tears. But with me, their spies must halt before the confessional. They know that Tessie is dead, and that I am dying. They know how the people in the house, aroused by an infernal scream, rushed into my room and found one living, and two dead. But they do not know that the doctor said, as they pointed to a horrible, decomposed heap on the floor, the livid corpse of the watchman from the church. I have no theory, no explanation. That man must have been dead for months. I think I'm dying. I wish the priest would. And that is the end of the yellow sign. Now, dear listeners, the question is, if you find a book found in a poisonous yellow-looking leather, dare you read it? Dare you not? What would you do in such a situation? I am so glad to hear that you guys thought that was good. It is an old story. Again, it was written by Mr. Robert W. Chambers. If you would like to read it yourself, I highly recommend it. You might find it somewhere free on the web, or you might find it within the book Chilling Horror Short Stories. Highly, highly recommend this book to anyone looking for good spook stories. And now we come to our last story. It is called The Damned Thing. This one is by far shorter. My laugh, really? That is all for really bio, really? The Damned Thing by Ambrose Bierce. By the light of a tallow candle, which had been placed on one end of the rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not, apparently, very legible, for the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light upon it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity a half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures, for besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough log walls, silent, motionless. And the room, being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his sides. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud. No one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur. The dead man only was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in through the aperture that served for a window, all ever unfamiliar noises of the night in the wilderness, the long, nameless note of a distant coyote, the still, pulsing thrill of tireless insects in trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of the day, the drone of great blundering beetles, and all that mysterious chorus of small sounds that seem always to have been but half heard, when they suddenly ceased, as if conscious of an indiscretion. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interest in matters of no practical importance. That was obvious in every line of their rugged face, obvious even in the dim light of a single candle. They were eventually men of vicinity, farmers, woodmen. The person reading was a trifle different, one would have said to him that he was of the world, worldly, albeit there was that in his attire which attested a certain fellowship of the organisms of his environment. His coat would hardly have passed muster in San Francisco. His footgear was not of urban origin, and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, was such that it had been considered if one had considered it as an article of mere personal adornment, he would have missed its meaning. In countenance, the man was rather proposing, with just a hint of sternness, though that he may have assumed or cultivated were as appropriate to one in authority, for he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading. It had been found among the dead man's effects, in his cabin, where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket. At that moment the door was pushed open, and a young man entered. He clearly was not of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad as those who dwell in the cities. His clothing dusty, however, as from travel. He had in fact been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "It is necessary to have done with this business tonight." The man smiled. "I am sorry to have kept you," he said. "I went away, not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I suppose I am called back to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to your newspaper differs probably from which you will give here under oath." "Oh, that," replied the other rather hotly, and with a visible flush, "is as you choose. I used manifold paper, and have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it's incredible, but as fiction. It may go as part of my testimony under oath." "But you say it is incredible." "It is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear that it is true." The coroner was apparently not greatly affected by the young man's manifest resentment. He was silent for some moments, his eyes upon the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin talked in whispers, but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently the coroner lifted his eyes and said, "We will resume the inquest." The men removed their hats. The witnesses were sworn. "What is your name?" the coroner asked. "William Harker. Age, 27. You know the deceased Hugh Morgan?" "Yes." "You were with him when he died?" "Near him." "How did that happen? Your presence, I mean." "I was visiting him at this place to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him." Pardon one moment. And his odd solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. I sometimes write stories." "I sometimes read them." "Thank you." "Stories in general, not yours." Some of the jurors laughed. Against a somber background, humor shows highlights. Soldiers in the intervals of a battle laugh easily, and a jest in a death chamber conquers by surprise. Relate the circumstances of this man's death, said the coroner. You may use any notes or memoranda that you please. The witness understood. Oh dear, pardon, choking on air. The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle and, turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted, began to read. The sun had hardly risen when we left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but he had only one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out. We crossed it by trail through the chaparral. On the other side was a comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was by a few yards in advance. Suddenly we heard a little distance to our right, and partly in front, a noise as of some animal thrashing about in the bushes, which we could see were violently agitated. "We've started a deer," said I. "I wish we had brought a rifle." Morgan, who had stopped and was intently watching the agitated charcoal, said nothing, but had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said, "you are not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still he did not reply, but catching a sight of his face as he turned it slightly toward me, I was struck by the pallor of it. Then I understood that we had serious business on hand, and my first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my piece as I moved. The bushes were quiet now, and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What is it? What the devil is it?" I asked. "The damned thing," he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky, unnatural. He was trembling visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seemed as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it so that it did not rise, and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly toward us. Nothing that I had ever seen had affected me so strangely as this unfamiliar, unaccountable phenomenon. Yet I am unable to recall any sense of fear. I remember, and tell it here because, singularly enough, I recollected it then, that once looking carelessly out of an open window, I momentarily mistook a small tree close at hand for one of the group of larger trees at a little distance away. It looked the same size as the others, but being more distinctly and sharply defined in mass and detail, seemed out of harmony with them. It was a mere falsification of the law of aerial perspective, but it startled, almost terrified me. We so rely upon the orderly operation of familiar natural laws, that any seeming suspension of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of unthinkable calamity. So now the apparently causeless movement of the herbage, and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance, were distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared actually frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulders and fire both barrels at the agitated grass. This before the smoke of the discharge had cleared. I heard a loud savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly from the spot. The same instant I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, which seemed to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying out as if in mortal agony, and mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Inexpressibly terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat. And may heaven in mercy spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down upon one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. His right arm was lifted. It seemed to lack the hand, at least. I couldn't see any. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports this extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partially blotted out. I cannot otherwise express it. Then a shifting of his position would bring it all into view again. All this must have occurred within a few seconds, yet in that time Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly. During the entire incident his shouts and curses were heard, as if through an enveloping uproar, such sounds of rage and fury as I had never heard from the throat of man or brute. For a moment only I stood irresolute. Then, throwing down my gun, I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit or some form of convulsion. Before I could reach his side, he was down, quiet. All sounds had ceased, but with a feeling of such terror as if these awful events had not inspired, I now saw that the same mysterious movement of the wild oats prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man toward the edge of the woods. It was only when it had reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead. The coroner rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body altogether naked and showing in the candlelight a clay-like yellow. It should not be buffering. I do apologize. You are welcome, Papyrus. Oh dear, I'm trying to fix it. Hold on, because I want you guys to all understand and be able to read the stories. Dear. Should not be doing that. Let's just see here. That should have fixed it. Did it? No, it did not, unfortunately. Let me see if it is. Ah, there we go. It should not be buffering now. Is it still buffering for everyone? Sorry, I'm a bit on a delay here. I think I'm delayed by at least 10-15 seconds. Oh dear, I believe it is my internet that is the issue. Dear, this should not be happening. Believe that fixed it. Hopefully it did. Of course it wouldn't. Why would you? Oh, blast it all. I believe it should be fixed now. At least on my end it's fixed. If it's still buffering, it is most likely YouTube. But no, where was I? Mayhaps we could possibly fix this. I believe there was still a little bit of the story yet. Let's see here. The companion was dead, is where we left off. The coroner rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man, lifting an edge of the sheet. He pulled it away, exposing the entire body, altogether naked, and showing in the candlelight a clay-like yellow. It had, however, broad maculations of bluish black, obviously caused by extravasated blood from contusions. The chest and sides looked as if they had been beaten with a bludgeon. There were terrible lacerations. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved round to the end of the table and undid a silk handkerchief, which had been passed under the chin and knotted on top of the head. When the kerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view repented their curiosity and turned away their faces. Witness Harker went to the open window and leaned out the sill, faint and sick. Dropping the kerchief upon the dead man's neck, the coroner stepped away to an angle of the room, and from a pile of clothing produced one garment after another, each of which he held up a moment for inspection. All were torn and stiff with blood. The jurors did not make a closer inspection. They seemed rather uninterested. They had in truth seen all this before, the only thing that was new to them being Harker's testimony. "Gentlemen," the coroner said, "we have no more evidence. I think your duty has been already explained to you. If there is nothing you wish to ask, you may go outside and consider your verdict." The foreman rose, a tall, bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. "I should like to ask one question, coroner," he said. "What asylum did this your last witness escape from?" "Mr. Harker," the coroner gravely and tranquilly, "from what asylum did you last escape?" Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin. "If you have done insulting me, sir," said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man, "I suppose I am at liberty to go?" "Yes." Harker started to leave, but paused, with his hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was strong in him, stronger than his sense of personal dignity. He turned about and said, "The book that you have there. I recognize it as Morgan's diary. You seemed greatly interested in it. You've read in it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public would like the book will cut no figure in this matter," replied the official, slipping it into his coat pocket. "All the entries in it were made before the writer's death." As Harker passed out the house, the jury re-entered and stood about the table on which now covered corpse showed under the sheet with a sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and scrap of paper, and wrote some rather laboriously the following verdict, which, with varying degrees of effort, all signed. "We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits." In the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having possibly a scientific value of suggestions. At the inquest upon his body, the book was not put in evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it not worth while to confuse the jury. The date of the first entries mentioned cannot be ascertained. The upper part of the leaf is torn away. The part of the entry remaining is as follows. Would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned away toward the centre, and again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought at first he had gone mad, but on returning to the house found no other alteration to his manner than what was observed. Can a dog see with his nose? Do orders impress olfactory centre with images of something is emitted? September the 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successfully disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time. But along the entire length of the ridge, all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. I don't like this. Several weeks' entries are missing. 3 leaves being torn from the book. September 22nd. It's been about here again. I find evidence of its presence every day. I watch again all of last night in the same cover, my gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning the fresh footprints were there, as before, yet I would have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all. It's terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real, I shall go mad. If they are fanciful, I am already mad. October the 3rd. I shall not go. It shall not drive me away. This is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October the 5th. I can stand it no longer. I have invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. October the 7th. I have the solution of the problem. It came to me last night suddenly, as by revelation. How simple, how terribly simple.